Okay, so thanks everybody for joining Community United for Safety and Protection. Amber, you're our Mistress of Ceremonies today.
Great. Yeah. So sex trafficking of minors in Alaska. So welcome everyone to the Community United for Safety and Protection Summer Education Series. This is the last of our series, and we do have these on our website, Sex Trafficking of Alaska. Thank you so much for joining us. Our goals for these series are to inform Alaskans and others that are interested about sex work and sex trafficking policy in Alaska. So this week we are going to be focusing on sex trafficking of minors in Alaska. And as we begin, CUSP acknowledges that we gratefully reside on unceded lands, and we invite you to join us in honoring and expressing deep gratitude to all Indigenous people of Alaska where we are conducting our work. So please reach out if you have any audio or visual issues during our presentation in the chat. Maxine's going to be manning the chat. And as you have seen, we're going to be recording this, and it's going to be available recorded, to watch later on our website. So this is approximately an hour long, and there's going to be time for questions. So feel free to add your questions to the chat. So who is CUSP? Most of us have been here tonight. I think before I saw a name that I didn't recognize, but Community United for Safety and Protection is a group of current and former sex workers, sex trafficking survivors, and our allies who are working towards safety and protection for everyone in Alaska's sex industry. Without further ado, here we go.
Okay, so we are on slide 4, right? Trying to see. Oh yeah. Okay, so this is going to be a lot of data. We will try to be very clear about what data comes from where and how complete the data sets are. If you have any questions about the data, please ask right away in the chat. We are going to cover what sex trafficking of minors looks like in Alaska, what the cases tell us about sex trafficking. So we're going to learn from the actual cases how police best find sex trafficking of minors, how we can prevent sex trafficking of minors, charging sexual abuse cases as sex trafficking cases, how prevalent is sex trafficking of minors in Alaska. So do ask your questions during the times for the questions. So next slide.
So we're going to focus in this presentation on the data. I know this can be an emotional issue. I was trafficked as a minor here in Alaska. Probably all of us that are presenting have some stories that we could tell you, but we're going to keep this focused on the policy and what we can learn from the data, and also understand that our understanding of the data is being informed by our own experiences, including our experiences reporting these crimes and advocating for people who've been the victims of these crimes. So there's two kinds of charges that we have in this data set. There's state charges, and we make records requests every year, basically, from the Department of Law. We had a few years there where they were not providing us the records that they needed to, but they now have provided us with case numbers. However, they just provided us with those case numbers a little while ago. So there are some of the newer cases that we don't have the charging documents for. So we don't have all of the information about those cases. Some of those cases we're familiar with personally, or we helped report them. And some of those cases there's, news articles and stuff about. So we have some information, but not all information about some of those newer cases. And you'll see in the presentation, whenever we show a statistic, it'll show at the top how many cases are included in that statistic. There were a bunch of cases that Department of Law sent us the case numbers for that are not listed on court view. So that could mean that the defendant was a minor and the case is not a public record, or it could mean that the charges have been dismissed. Most of these cases are like sequential, and sequential with other cases that are included. So we are pretty sure that these are cases where police did stings on customers, charged all of them, and they were mostly able to get their charges dismissed because of just things about the law in Alaska that the cops, I guess, didn't realize before they went out and started doing all these stings. There's federal charges. So in the past, we've been able to go to the federal clerk of the court and search and get all of the cases. For the last few years, actually, the Fairbanks clerk of the court has not had their computer available for searching anymore. So it can only be done in Anchorage, and we don't have that. But what we do have is, if you go to the justice.gov and their press release section, you can search for sex trafficking and prostitution, and you can see that they do press releases about most of the cases that they charge and that are convicted. But there are some cases, for example, there was a case where they charged a victim of trafficking with conspiracy to traffic, and that case was not listed in there. There's another case that was a really long time ago where there was a guy in Homer with a boat who was victimizing young ladies, and that case also was not included there. So we know that this is not 100% complete data set, but I'm pretty sure we're not off by more than 2 or 3 cases. Another thing is that I tried to not enter conspiracy cases or cases where somebody was charged with conspiracy to traffic. And that's a case where you have like one sex trafficker, but there's like people like the landlord are being charged with conspiracy with him to sex traffic. I did not mostly enter those cases. So for like the Sabil Mujahid case and the Jerry Starr case, there were a whole bunch of co-conspirators that were charged, including victims. None of those are entered. However, I did accidentally enter 2 of them in newer cases. So, but we will tell you about that throughout as we get to it. And if you're interested in this nerdy stuff, make sure you're on our email list, because I'm going to make a really comprehensive report with all of the charges of prostitution and sex trafficking and everything in Alaska since the year 2000, because I actually have almost all of that data, and I'm going to get the rest of it. And we will have that report up on our website. And if you're on our email address, you'll get an email about it next year.
Great job. So we're going to start digging in here. So since 2000, there have been 10 federal cases and 4 state cases involving minors. So 3 of the federal cases were linked, so you might call it 7 federal cases. We have not attempted to count victims because we've noticed that oftentimes victims are not mentioned in the charging documents. So we have to be thinking about that during this presentation as we move forward. Next slide.
So these are the things that people were charged with. 2 people were charged just with soliciting prostitution, 2 men, and both of those in the same case, they were also charged with crimes against minors. So I included them here in this data set. But as I get more cases into this database, I won't have a way to include those cases. And I don't have the charging documents for them, so I'm not sure if maybe I don't know what was, actually going on in those cases, but we have included them here. Under state law, we do have the crime of felony prostitution, which is purchasing sex from a minor. That's a Class C felony, which has, I think, a 1-year jail sentence, and 1 to 5 years. It's a fairly minor felony. Now, at the federal level, buying sex from a minor is called sex trafficking, and is you know, we regularly see people getting like 20 to 25-year sentences for that at the federal level. And then we have 3 kinds of federal crimes that are included in this data set. So there's forcing someone into prostitution, the use of force, fraud, or coercion against somebody who maybe is already a sex worker, is trying to become a sex worker, or is being forced into sex work, or the federal charge of sex trafficking of a minor, or of buying sex from a minor. So all of these cases that are in here are cases involving minors.
So these are the additional things defendants were charged with in the same cases. So we're looking at different numbers. So many times people will have multiple charges. I know that happens in other states, and in Alaska we have, sorry, I think my earbud went out. In Alaska, we have a lot of overcharging. So it looks like we have people that are charged with those charges, also with drugs, assault, sexual abuse of a minor. I'm thinking sexual assault of a minor is listed up there, but it could be sexual abuse of a minor. Enticement.
You're right, Amber, that was my mistake, sorry.
Okay, so it's sexual abuse of a minor. Enticement, child pornography, felon in possession, and that means felon in possession of a weapon, usually a gun, and then money crimes, which could be maybe some kind of fraud or having a credit card that does not belong to them.
Confused yet? I know, we're getting down to it. We're sorting it out here. In 2 of the federal cases, victims were charged as co-conspirators. Both were Black and very young adults, and they took plea deals to lessen their jail time, and now they must register as sex offenders. Those cases are not included in this data set. So out of the 14 that were counted here, 2 were charged as co-conspirators at the federal level, and 2 victims were charged as co-conspirators too, unfortunately. Next slide.
So when we look at the police agencies that are involved in going after these cases, 80% of these cases involved the FBI Anchorage PD task force. 30% of them involved the state troopers. Now, the state troopers have the Special Crimes Investigative Unit, which operated for several years from 2014 through, you know, they don't tell us when they start and stop, but it seemed like through about 2019 and then pop back up in 2022, and they seem to still be operating today. And they said that they had the primary goal of locating and rescuing minor victims who are being forced into prostitution, but there have been 0 cases that they investigated, despite all the stings that they've done on sex workers and our customers. So when we look at how these cases came to light, some of these cases we had personal knowledge of, some of these cases we don't have the charging documents for. So you can see that this is only includes 9 cases here. But the large majority are reported by the victim. And the victim might report to the police, or sometimes they've reported to healthcare providers or to their parents, who have then called the police. This validates with our data from Rhode Island, where we did the same thing in Rhode Island. We pulled all of the cases, and we've seen that people do know when they're being victimized, and people do call for help when they're being victimized. And that is the way that most of these cases come to light. There were a couple cases that were reported by sex workers and by clients, or from other witnesses, like people who work in hotels or things like that. So reports from sex workers and clients are important. and should be encouraged, and reports from victims are also important and should be encouraged.
So one of the questions that we always have when we're going through these charging documents, when we're reading through stuff is, did the police engage in sexual contact during any investigation? Because we know that typically it is a general practice and legally allowable for police to have sexual contact with us in the course of these prostitution sting operations that are oftentimes talked about in publicly as sex trafficking sting operations. They're looking to protect children, so they run these prostitution sting operations where they're allowed to have sexual contact with people that with actual people like me who are actual prostitutes, or people that they're trying to identify as sex trafficking victims. So our question is, did the police engage in sexual contact during this investigation? So we've got 9 cases that answered. 5 said no. 3 confirmed that they were contacted sexually. They were touched sexually by police in the course of these sting operations. And 1 seemed to be implied in the documentation, but it wasn't clear. So the other thing that's of note is that the same officer is identified as having the sexual contact with all the victims in these cases. So that is, that's a big concern. So we'll go to the next slide.
So more than half of the 13 cases for which we have information to be charged since 2000 did not have any involvement with the sex industry. So when we look at the numbers, does this case have sex industry involvement? We're looking at number, I think it's the first one there. Yes, it's 6. So 2 of those cases were actually conspirators and a 3rd case. So this is 6 perpetrators and 4 cases. I know it's hard to kind of follow with these numbers, but so when we're looking at 6 for yes out of the 13, and then we're looking at no, which is the other half, and no, and that's with sexual assault of a minor, or sexual abuse of a minor, sorry. And then there's also no for a fictitious victim. And that's when police set up a sting and there's not really a victim. They just have an ad up, and then they're having words in the ad that maybe somebody should know that it's a trafficking victim, or they also can say they should know it was somebody underage. So when we hear about fictitious victims, that's what they are talking about there.
So there were 6 sexual abuse of a minor cases that were charged as sex trafficking, or that are included in this data set, which is the same number of cases that there are involving the sex industry. So I wanted to include this press release from the U.S. Attorney's Office as an example of what we're talking about when we say sexual abuse of a minor cases that are being charged as sex trafficking. And this is a case where Wally Roy Carter, 61 years old, of Kotzebue, was indicted by the federal grand jury for sex trafficking of a minor. And it says, according to a criminal complaint, he became the subject of a federal investigation when the FBI received a tip, so a report from the victim, probably, alleging that a minor had been sexually abused by him 15 times over the course of 3 years, with the first instance occurring when the victim was 10 years old. He gave the victim money and provided them with alcohol and marijuana before or after the sexual abuse. The complaint further alleges that the sexual abuse happened in his home, his vehicle, and on one occasion he took her by boat to a cabin where the victim tried to escape from Carter at least 5 times. So anytime we see sexual abuse of a minor and there's money, drugs, or alcohol involved, it can be charged as sex trafficking. Okay, next slide. And then we also have cases with fictitious victims. And we've only had, I think, the 1 case of that here in Alaska. And this is a case where this guy messaged with an undercover detective for about 6 months about meeting up with two fictional girls aged 13 and 14. And in this case, you know, it was very clear that he was attempting to purchase sex with a minor. When we look at these cases like countrywide, all over the US, there are a lot of cases where you read them and you're like, wow, like this guy was trying to like buy sex with a 6-year-old and showed up with duct tape and handcuffs, and you're so glad that he got the guy. And then there's other cases that are where you read it and you're like, well, how's the guy even supposed to know that this was a minor? Like the ad had pictures of a 40-year-old police officer, or 40-year-old police officers who opened the door, but she like texted him and asked him if he could buy her cigarettes on the way, and he was supposed to know that that meant that she was underage. So there's a lot of variety in these cases. And you know, some of them I read and I'm all for it. Some of them I'm like, I don't know about these cases. But all of these cases have no actual victims. So there's somebody being charged with sex trafficking, and that makes us think that somebody has been sex trafficked, but nobody has been sex trafficked in these cases. So when we look at all of these cases, there's two pretty clear patterns that emerge. One type of trafficker is engaged in or attempting to engage in making an income from pimping out minors. Now, most people who are rational know that, like, if you are going to try to make a living from being a pimp, you would not want to do it with minors because you're going to go to jail for a really long time, right? So these are people who are not rational. They're often also charged with drug-related crimes. They're often also charged with extreme violence. And in many of these cases, they have previous convictions in other states for things like murder or, you know, shooting people. And then the other type of trafficker, and we're gonna call this a trafficker in quotes, right, is a child molester who pays or provides drugs or alcohol to their victims. In one case, which was a case that we reported to the FBI, oh no, sorry, that's the next one. In one case, the perpetrator had victims perform for sexual abuse of a minor materials, which is what we call child pornography now. And in another case, which was the case that we reported to the FBI, the perpetrator encouraged and facilitated his victim to engage in prostitution, but he didn't make any money from it. He was just excited by the idea that he was turning a teenager into a prostitute. So are these the same crime, right? Do they require the same policy response? Do we do the same thing to prevent them? Do we do the same thing to address them? Should we be calling them the same thing? I want to know what you guys think. So if you have any thoughts on that, please put them in the chat.
And how to find sex trafficked minors. So when we look at these numbers, in 78% of these cases, the victim reported to police. So that means it's either a healthcare professional or someone else who called the police. People know when they're being victimized, and we need to reduce barriers to reporting. So the most common barrier is fear of the police, resulting in criminalization of prostitution. It's also past experiences with the police, past experiences of community members that they're talking with, police killing children like Easter Lifa. These kind of situations where people have interactions with the police are barriers to reporting. And then in other cases, there were reports by sex workers or clients. So if a victim is isolated and unable to call for help, the client may be the only person they can confide in. So we need to reduce barriers here by letting sex workers know that we have immunity to report heinous crimes, and by changing the law to extend the same immunity to customers. So in 2016, CUSP was able to get it in HB 91 that we're able to report heinous crimes like murder, kidnapping, sex trafficking, assaults 1, 2, and 3. And those were part of an HB 91 that are still in effect. And not many people know that there's immunity to report. We can look at this when we're talking about Brian Stephen Smith, Valerie Kassler. She did not know that she had immunity, but she still took that risk and she reported. But if she did know that she had immunity, maybe we would have been able to have the actual phone that she had to put those images and videos on. And that could have actually facilitated more of an investigation from police from possible other victims. And then when we talk about reducing barriers, we also need to really look at immunity for clients to be able to report. And we do not have that in Alaska. Let me back up a little bit. Because Anchorage Municipality had Ordinance 84, people in Anchorage still didn't have immunity to report. Sex workers still did not have immunity. And by then, I was able to go, and there was a group of us that went to the Anchorage Municipality, and we were told that it would not be great to, that we had Seneca, the municipal prosecutor. We also had police officers stating that they did not want sex workers to have immunity, that it could be possibly a get out of jail card, get out of jail for free card. So we did win that. So both in Alaska and in Anchorage, we have immunity to report. We don't have that for customers. We would like to introduce that at some point in legislation. We don't know when that will be. But during all the years, including currently, the Special Crimes Investigation Unit of the state troopers have been doing stings on customers and sex workers to save the children, so they say. But there have been no involved or charges of sex trafficking of a minor during any of the course of their investigations. So these stings are ineffective. And for them to look for sex trafficking minors or reduce trust, they just reduce trust between sex workers and, the police by looking for sex trafficking victims while having sexual contact with sex workers while they're doing stings does not build trust.
So, everybody wants to know how to prevent sex trafficking of minors. And the answer to that question is to provide housing and support. We've included in our tile link here, or we've included in our tile a link to a YouTube. Our YouTube channel is Sex Worker Nation on YouTube. And we did what was called a lunch and learn at the Alaska State Legislature Capitol building during the session one year, where Dr. Alix Lutnik came and spoke to the legislators to educate them about her research on minor sex trafficking and what helped and what didn't help. And she talked a lot about there just needs to be some permanent, stable housing for youth in the sex trade. And also what we can show you is a press release from the U.S. Attorney. Federal charges were brought here in the District of Alaska, where a man was sentenced to 13 years for sex trafficking of minors, 2 minors involved. The minors were 14 years old and 17 years old. And in this press release, the U.S. attorney says that, the minors didn't have access to housing or any type of support when they came to Anchorage. So, when you have your lack of services called out in your press release by your federal district, U.S. District Attorney's Office, things are pretty bad. And other research over the years has shown that if you want to prevent minors to become involved in the sex trade, you have to provide them as a primary, as a minimum, safe, permanent housing. And housing is such a big issue for even adults who are precariously housed these days. A lot of people end up in the sex trade because they've been dehoused and they're struggling to pay those high rents even as adults. So we need to really be providing that on a permanent basis for youth, They should have a right to that, and the public should be providing that. Next slide.
So the conflation of sex trafficking with sexual abuse of a minor is unnecessarily stigmatizing to the victims. We have prosecutors in Alaska and counselors in Alaska who, as soon as they see that sex trafficking label, they're telling people that they're broken, that they're never going to be able to have a healthy relationship in their life, and things like that, that are really stigmatizing and harmful and unnecessary, as well as just the stigma that comes with having been involved in the sex industry that we don't need to be putting on youth who have not been involved in the sex industry, or putting on anybody, honestly. But this allows agencies that do not work with victims who have been abused within the sex industry to claim that they're serving a high number of sex trafficking victims. And this increases their funding and builds their reputations on this lie that they're helping people who, are involved in the sex industry when they're not. And then we go to them to try to get them to help people who have actually been trafficked in the sex industry, and they don't know what to do. They have no experience with those kinds of victims. This is also a way to rebrand like the bad kids, right? Like when I was a homeless teenager, I was, everybody just thought I was a bad kid. If I was living with a man in his 40s and having sex with him for housing, then I was the bad one. I was the one who was going to break his heart. I was, and so this is a way to change the narrative about kids who are having survival sex, and to help the public realize that these kids are being victimized, rather than just thinking that these are bad kids. And it also, right, helps with the funding for these organizations that are helping those kids. But when we look on the level of the actual kids, it doesn't seem like this change is trickling down to help them so much. And then the other thing that this does is create statistics that are misinterpreted as the number of minors who are being actually abused in the sex industry. And it's used to criminalize sex workers and sex trafficking survivors and our support staff as sex traffickers. So I really want to know what Alaskans think about this conflation of sex trafficking and sexual abuse of a minor. So if you have any kind of opinion, I'd really appreciate it if you could put it in the chat.
Amber, are you muted?
All right, take two. So questions about the case data before we get into the prevalence of sex trafficking of minors in Alaska. Does anyone have any questions or some comments that they want to share before we get into some more? You can unmute yourself.
I have a question. It might not be directly related to the case data, but it had to do with the housing too. Like what exactly is the housing situation in Alaska, and then like the government support after these cases, after these cases are, tried and there's results? Like, is there homes, or are there not homes available?
No. So,
Okay, no.
So we have, this is a long answer, right?
I assumed it would be. That's why I didn't know if I should ask now, but yeah.
Yeah, so we have a shelter for youth in Anchorage called Covenant House. We have one in Fairbanks as well. And Covenant House has received a lot of money from the Federal Office for Victims of Crimes to serve sex trafficking victims. And we're going to get into their definition of sex trafficking here, like actually on the next slide, right? They have come a long ways since 10 years ago, but what we see really consistently is that a lot of the rules that they have made in order to become more like friendly to sex trafficking has pushed real victims of sex trafficking away from receiving services. So if they have somebody come into the shelter who has been involved in the commercial sex industry, they're like, oh no, this kid is going to take some other kids with them and leave, and then they're going to be sex trafficked too. And they also have introduced rules about, you know, like having kids who are on drugs, which not all, but a lot of kids who are involved in the sex industry are using drugs. And so they specifically don't want kids in the shelter who are using drugs, specifically because it could be a trigger to sex trafficking victims in the shelter. But that, right. In other cases, right, they have some funding for housing for youth who are like 18 to 25, maybe, or 21. And they have provided housing vouchers, or I'm not sure if they call them vouchers, but housing funding for some sex trafficking survivors. The Alaska Housing Finance, AFHC or whatever, has received a lot of money, like over $1 million, I believe, from the federal OVC grants to provide housing for sex trafficking victims. I'm sure they're providing housing to somebody, but I have not seen anybody who has been a victim of trafficking in the sex industry be able to get housing from them. And that's specifically because they have convictions for conspiring to traffic themselves, making them a sex offender, or drug-related convictions that make them ineligible for housing through that agency. So yeah, that's a huge problem. And then, right, in cases where where victims are made to register as sex offenders, it's not just the being able to get housing part of the housing, but their address is public on the sex offender registry. And often while their perpetrators are still being tried for these crimes and, you know, are threatening them at their, you know, or, you know, having their family members or other associates go to their houses and threaten them because their houses are public record. And so that can, you know, it's not like they can just move to a new place and not have their address be public record. Their address will continue to be public record, or else they will go to jail. So that becomes like an additional housing issue.
Okay.
I want to make a
And
comment quickly about Covenant House as well, because I've had family members that are living there, and I had one that was kicked out on New Year's at 1 a.m. So when we're looking at support and housing for minors, we also should be looking at putting them at risk. And when places like the Covenant House get all of this funding and they continue to, you know, create barriers to who can get in for services, but also create some very like strong like areas where they can be victimized and being put out in the streets. We really have to be like cognizant of how harmful these places can be. He was 16. I was going to transfer money so he could even go get a hotel room, but because he's under 18, he can't even get a hotel room even if he had money. And it was very cold out. Luckily, I was in town. I was able to go get him. But this happens. When I went there the next morning, he wasn't the only one. This has happened continually with other people, other young men, other young women, other, you know, non-binary, just these kids that are supposed to be getting support are not getting support.
Yeah.
And so, Rachel, if you read Dr. Alix Lutnik's book, which is called Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking, she did like a nationwide study where she surveyed people who provided case management to minor sex trafficking victims. And there's this chart that just always stuck with me where she, you know, identified that she asked them, what is the primary need of your client? And in like 98% of the cases, the primary need was housing. And 98% of these places did not offer housing, right? They offer counseling, they offer case management, they think like, oh, maybe because you're involved in sex work, you need your soul saved, or you need some kind of moral instruction to teach you not to do that. When actually, like, you just need housing, like a safe place to live. Which was my experience as a minor in Alaska too. Okay, any other questions about the case data? All right, so back to Covenant House. This is the question that is used on the Covenant House human trafficking, HTIAM, human trafficking identification tool. And this is the question. So this question has to do with sexual activity, which could mean dancing, stripping, posing for photos, or having any kind of sex, including oral sex. And it says sometimes young people who are homeless or are having difficulties with their family have very few options to survive or fulfill their basic needs, such as food or shelter. Sometimes they are exploited, or they feel the need to use their sexuality to help them survive. Have you or anyone else ever received anything of value, such as money, a place to stay, food, drugs, gifts, or favors in exchange for performing a sexual activity? If they answer yes to this, then they are a sex trafficking victim, according to Covenant House, which goes back to this federal definition of commercial sexual exploitation of minors. And there's a lot of legal language floating around. But the bottom line here is that if a minor or somebody that they know has gone out dancing with a guy and then, been taken out to a nice dinner or given gifts or favors or drugs, they're probably going to answer yes to this question. So, and that's how we get these numbers that you'll see on the next slide.
Okay, so the cases of sex trafficking during 1 year period reported by the Covenant House in the Alaska Governor's Council on Human and Sex Trafficking 2024 data summary report said that there were 27 cases. The cases meeting the criminal definition of sex trafficking of an adult or a minor that were reported to law enforcement agencies in Alaska, as reported yearly in the Crime in Alaska Sexual Offenses Report, was actually 1 to 2 a year. So this means that 25 to 26 of the cases reported by Covenant House either did not meet the criminal definition of sex trafficking, or Covenant House was not mandated to report them because they did not happen to be minors. So you can see here a couple of things. You can see here how the confusing definition can be used to inflate the numbers, and that allows nonprofits like Covenant House, the Alaska Governor's Council on Human and Sex Trafficking, be able to inflate these numbers. And the reason they want to inflate the numbers is because they'll qualify and get more federal money when they're trying to compete for those federal grants. And then you see the other thing that you can deduce here is that there's some problems with the way that crime is being reported in Alaska. That there's these very low numbers of actual sex trafficking or adult or adult or minors. So, we have to talk about, really, how are we identifying victims, and where is the money being spent, especially when, we're lacking housing for use, as a baseline here in the state. Next slide.
So are the police just not looking hard enough for victims? We have definitely heard a lot that the problem, that it's not that there's no sex trafficking, there's just, the police aren't out there doing enough to find it. Definitely there are things that the police could do a lot better to incentivize the reporting of these kinds of cases. I could tell you definitely about, several cases of sex trafficking of adults where the victim decided not to report just based on their previous experience with police or what's happened to other sex workers and sex trafficking survivors who have reported. And there's definitely a lot that the police could do to improve their responses when people do report. We've seen that sex workers and especially sex trafficking survivors, about twice as often as sex workers, the police won't even take their reports when they try to report, although hopefully that's changed by now. But definitely there have been several cases that we've been involved in reporting or trying to report that have never seen any charges filed. A few years ago, Terry Stallman went crazy on my Facebook and posted a full confession of sex trafficking me when I was 15 years old. He even confirmed my age several times. And, when I sent those to the FBI, they said they were not interested in trying to charge him with anything. But we do have a lot of police officers out there full-time looking for sex trafficking victims, and especially looking for minor sex trafficking victims. At the State Troopers, we had the Special Crimes Investigative Unit from 2014 up through maybe 2019, and then they disappeared for a few years, and they popped up again in 2022. And that was a unit of 3 officers and 1 technician, full-time, focused on their primary mission was to locate and rescue minors who were being forced into prostitution. We had the FBI's Project Innocence Lost up until a few years ago, which was replaced more recently by their cooperative child exploitation and human trafficking task force that they have with Anchorage, which has 1 full-time officer who is just devoted to that task force, as well as other officers who are involved at APD and several officers or agents who are involved at the FBI. And then we had for many years yearly stings with the FBI's Operation Cross Country. Those stings do not seem to have resulted in an increase in discovering cases of sex trafficking of a minor in the sex industry. If I were to show you a chart, a graph of the cases of trafficking of actual non-fictitious minors in the sex industry, it would look like this. There would be a big dip and it would go to 0 for most of the years that the Special Crimes Investigative Unit was flying around the state looking for domestic minor sex trafficking victims full-time. So this is obviously not the way to find trafficking victims. All right.
So that brings us to the aggravator solution. So we want to ask, should sexual abuse of a minor cases where the perpetrator pays the victim be charged as SAM with an aggravator instead of being called sex trafficking? So we want to bring this up because we actually have an aggravator in draft. We developed this after having some discussions with the Alaska Children's Alliance, looking at a solution, like how can this actually be an aggravator? We are hoping to find a sponsor next session or a session after that, but should SAM cases where the perpetrator pays the victim be charged as SAM with an aggravator instead of being called sex trafficking?
Amber, can you explain what an aggravator is?
Sure. So in court, when you're being sentenced, there's things that are aggravators and then there's things that are mitigators. Aggravators are going to kind of give an enhancement at the time of sentencing. It can kind of lead to an increased sentence, even if for like a first time felon or first time charge, whereas mitigating factors kind of lessen the sentence. Aggravators kind of bump up that sentence. So it's kind of the worst case. It kind of gives it a little bit more oomph. even if it is their first felony conviction.
So I think Bella had a couple things to say in the chat about, I don't know if you want to unmute Bella and talk about, the Polaris Project and some of those other groups that,
they're kind of the same thing,
or
but
I
they're,
guess,
and that's where it came out of. It came out of Brown University. And I had the pleasure of confronting Kathleen Chung, the co-founder, in 2014. And I didn't even know shit. It was 2014. And she was like, I'm here as an alumni, not a government official. And the women are calling in, self-identify, but we don't have the resources. They get $7 million to answer a friggin' phone. And I got up, waved enormous numbers around and made them retract the average age of entry. I called her out. Where's the services? And I'm even telling other groups that don't care about sex workers, care about trans people, care about gay kids, how many of them are going to be on the street the next generation from hate families? We need, as a community, to have LGBT halfway houses, not the government. So anyway, but they do the same thing with the numbers. You call looking for food stamps or dial the wrong number and you're counted. And me and Christina Pereira, I think it was around 2013, actually reported someone. The guys were on US Sex Guide agreeing that this lady couldn't consent. There was something wrong with her. They would try to get guys to go gangbang her without condoms. And we found out what happens. They give you a reference number and they go, oh, we don't investigate anything. We just relay tips to the police. Well, we could all just dial 911 and save $7 million. And we have that on a blog that's, archived and stuff. So, yeah, it's just like, they can't find enough victims. And I think they could find more victims if they would cooperate with us instead of harass us. Makes sense, but that's all. Thank you.
yeah, I mean, stop arresting, adults and minors for prostitution would go a long way towards turning the tide against police and doing some goodwill. So I put a couple links in the chat. One was to the YouTube video of Dr. Alix Lutnik speaking at the Lunch and Learn in Juneau, Alaska.
Looks like the last one that you put can't be viewed.
Oh, okay. I'll try it again, but also I put a link to her book, Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking. And I think the other thing I'm going to put in the chat, if I can, is I'm going to put in a link to our event that we're having, for people in the sex trade, and even adults or people in the public can join those of us in the sex trade who are going to be having discussions about the upcoming November elections and the issues that are facing our community and what we're going to do to organize around, whomever is going to be elected. We saw recently that the Democratic National Committee removed mentioning protection for sex workers from their platform yesterday. So we're just devastated about that. And especially when there's going to be so much, competition in this race, and it's expected to be a tight race. I'm not sure how Democrats can think that they can just dispose of our our votes and dispatch us without really, considering that we're, valid people, that we're voters for number one, and that, we will be voting. And so, yeah, you're welcome to join us for that webinar. Got a link in there that you can register for. If there's no more questions, we've reached our hour time. You can go ahead and raise your hand if you want to, but we want to thank you for taking the time to learn about the sex worker issues and the sex trafficking policy in Alaska. We have another track to address actual, oh, no, that's out of date. But yeah, you can go see, go to amberbats.blog.com, or you can follow Amber on Twitter, which is also known as X now, at Amber B, or Alaska Amber B, and she's on TikTok at Amber in Alaska. And of course, you want to definitely subscribe to our Substack, taraburns.substack.com. And you can go to our website at sextraffickingalaska.com and sign up for our newsletter. So, last words, Amber or Tara?
I have
Thank you
a
for coming.
I have a couple last words. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you are going to be interested in Coyote's book that is coming out in just a couple weeks. So if you're not already on the Coyote Rhode Island email list, you should get on it, because we're going to send you an email the day that the book comes out, and we will have a special price for the first couple days for the people who are on our email list. It is a book of participatory action research by and for sex workers with a policy focus, and the name of it is Sex Work Policy. Okay, Amber, it's all you.
Nothing. I think we're going to have this up, the recorded one up on the website, and just stay tuned. We're going to be doing more of these. We're talking about maybe doing monthly, talking about different things from what is legalization as opposed to decriminalization, and just some more informational things. Let us know what you would like to hear as well.
Great,
That's all.
thanks for that. And Bella has gone ahead and put her email address so you can gain access to early ordering for that book. We're so excited about it. We'll be doing a Zoom about that book. It's just very unique and very special, and we'll be posting this video up on our website at sextraffickingalaska.com, as well as on our YouTube channel, Sex Worker Nation. So we'll put a bunch of links in the show notes there. So thank you everybody for joining us today.